I went on a date with a vegan recently, and she asked me what I do for a living. I responded that I work with animals. And she went on and told me this whole story about how much she loves animals, how she works as a veterinarian, and it's exactly why she decided to become a vegan. So she asked me exactly what I do working with animals. And then I told her that I herd cattle into a slaughterhouse. Assuming you're still watching, recently Luke Smith put out a video about Skinner's box and how you can train animals to do certain things without any intervention of anyone. I had this video recorded and obviously can't release it in its original form, so this is kind of a re-record. B.F. Skinner actually was a behaviorist, and I had not heard about him until Luke Smith's recent video. My video was focused on Ivan Pavlov, who is really kind of the originator of the behavioral field in psychology. And you've probably heard of Ivan Pavlov. He's the one with the dogs, and he trained the dogs to respond to stimuli like buzzers or lights, and they would drool when scientists would come in to feed them. What they don't tell you often about Ivan Pavlov is that he actually wasn't a psychologist, even though he sort of originated the behaviorist perspective on psychology. He was actually studying the digestive tracts of the dogs. The conditions in his facilities were rather horrific because he was trying to understand the digestive tract of animals in general, and you would consider his dogs tortured because he basically cut out sections of their digestive tracts. People who went into his facilities were horrified at the conditions, and it kind of goes to point to something really important about his studies in originating this field of behaviorism, and that is that dogs don't necessarily drool 4 ounces of saliva under normal circumstances. These dogs were tortured, and they were often starving because their digestive tracts weren't functioning correctly. So they were desperate for any kind of food that they could get access to. Now, Ivan Pavlov eventually did expand his experiments to humans. I think that he actually put a saliva mechanism on a child, and there's a photo. But what this obviously points to is that normal dogs don't behave like that. You have to put them in an awful situation to get them to follow this behaviorist model. And since we are people and we have free choice, if you don't want to subject yourself to the experiment, they can't hurt you. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you don't have to engage in their human experiments because if you're using these apps, you are engaging in a human experiment. It's even public record that Facebook performed human experiments on their users by showing one group a bunch of happy stuff and another group a bunch of awful stuff and seeing what kind of posts they posted at the end of the day. Another study that you'll hear about sometimes is rats and how rats will do specific illicit substances until they die. But again, this doesn't actually point to the whole story. Rats are incredibly social creatures, so when you throw them into isolation, when you force them to distance from other rats, they sort of go crazy. It's kind of a form of torture, again, very similar to what Ivan Pavlov was doing to his dogs. Normal rats, when you put them in with a bunch of other rats, even if you give them access to highly addictive illicit substances, they will prefer to socialize and play with the other rats over doing those substances. Normal rats will not do drugs until they die. They might experiment with them, they might do them occasionally, they probably won't do them at all. And the important thing to note here is that you can choose to exit the experiment. They cannot force you to continue. And this is where it leads us to a book by someone named Nir Eyal, and it's called Hooked. He actually wrote a subsequent title, which is called Indistractable, where he talks through how to break the habits of apps. The purpose of Hooked, though, was to outline exactly what Silicon Valley is doing to get you to engage with the apps that they release. The gist of it is they give you something that is really shiny and exciting, and they get you to enter, and they give you a bunch of rewards. It's kind of like a rat trap. They give you these rewards, and then you start going in, and over time, they start to change the way that they distribute those rewards so that they are increasingly random and smaller in quantity. And what he actually outlines in the book is a very explicit set of steps. In your mind, when you have a reward, say you meet a new group of friends, you accomplish a difficult task, or you learn something that you never learned before and you're starting to make new connections, your brain will release a hormone known as dopamine. Dopamine gets you really excited, and it usually gives people a high sense of well-being in general. Dopamine is one of the mechanisms that drugs like caffeine influences, or Adderall if you have a prescription, or there's a bunch of various stimulants on the market that will cause you to either release more dopamine or to stop your body from taking dopamine out of circulation, and people use them to make themselves feel good. But what's interesting about the series of steps that Silicon Valley actually takes is they don't feed you dopamine all the time, because if people always feel good, they actually stop engaging with something, because you have kind of a diminishing return on investment for any kind of activity. If you learn something and it's a huge breakthrough, you get a lot of dopamine. But if you learn something and it's really not that important, you really don't get very much. So what Silicon Valley learned was that they could actually start making the dopamine hits harder and harder to get, which actually made people feel the dopamine. But what's interesting about the discovery was that what people crave isn't the dopamine. They crave the craving. And they've done experiments on rats again, of course, where they plugged into specific parts of rats' brains and had them push a lever. And the part of the brain where rats will not stop pressing the lever and they will forgo anything in favor of pressing that lever is actually anticipation of reward. And that is how apps like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even largely YouTube, which you're watching this on right now, work and try and pull people in and keep them coming back to the app, is finding that new little thing or getting that like. Because it is randomized. But since they've hooked people into the app, they now have a group of willing subjects that are essentially subjecting themselves to low-grade torture. To an extent, we are all, right now, Pavlov's dogs. And this isn't theoretical, this is happening right now. But remember, there's one difference between us and Pavlov's dogs, and that is that we are free human beings, and we are sentient, and we can determine our own destinies. We can choose to leave the experiment. I tried to strike a hopeful tone there, but I wanted to explore this subject a little bit further because there was something else that I had in the original video that Luke Smith kind of alluded to. And it's a question: why would anyone want a population of addicts? What Luke Smith pointed out is that people act very erratically, but very predictably. And one of the things about addicts is they might behave very erratically, but they're very predictable. And predictable people can be controlled. You buzz the buzzer, You turn on the light, they start drooling, figuratively. And I recently saw a meme that actually summed this up quite perfectly. It said something along the lines of, good citizens don't think. And then it went down the line of how thinking leads to loss of control for the powers that be. This channel is dedicated to helping people essentially unplug from the matrix to exit the experiment. And your first step might be different than mine. And I've got a long way to go to unplug from this whole construct that's been set up. But if you are looking for a way out, before you go through and de-Google your phone, before you delete your Facebook, there's one thing that you can do that is far more effective than any of those things, and that is to not give the most important real estate to these apps. That means don't give it space in your mind, and don't give it time. I think it was Seneca, the philosopher, he talked extensively about how people waste time, but it's actually the most limited resource that we have in our lives. Most of us get basically 30,000 days, and that's it. So turn off your apps. Stop engaging with the experiment by turning off notifications. It's probably going to be really tough. It was for me, and the thing that kind of set me off was back when I was engaging with apps, it was dating apps that were actually my main concern. I started getting messages late at night, and I got dopamine kicks right when I needed to be winding down for bed. And after reading Nir Eyal's book Hooked and then experiencing these situations where I couldn't get to sleep because my apps were notifying me, it became very apparent that I was behaving erratically and predictably like an addict. And turning off those app notifications cleared my mind to the point that I can now separate myself from these various tools that are not being used with us as customers, but us being sold as products to advertising agencies to extract resources from us, because addicts are easy to predict. And it is tempting for us to think that everything is going to come down to some kind of an epic battle. We are constantly being fed all of these storylines where you think that the world is going to come down to fighting the Death Star or going up against the orcs on a large battlefield from like Lord of the Rings. But in reality, most of life and most of the battles that we face are long and grueling and are a series of choices. And that's what we need to do, is we need to make the right series of choices to exit the experiment so that we are not owned, we are not subjects. We are free individuals that are working for the betterment of the world. And as we unplug from the matrix, the most important thing that we need to do is build. And we're going to be better able to build if we're not being manipulated. Building is really important because all control ends. The control that Silicon Valley and these apps have over the people that we love right now will end. And if we build, then there will be something there to replace it when it does end. And then we can welcome our brothers and sisters, our mothers and fathers, back with open arms as they awaken from their slumber. So remember, disconnect your app notifications and build. Build community, build economy, build systems and skills, build strength, build knowledge, and build community. Because community is probably the most important thing to catch people when this falls. Thank you for stopping by. This is Nick, signing out.